I want to point out two things that Ross said. One, yeah, I have a PhD, but in history, not in any sort of hard science whatsoever. So if you have questions, hard science related questions about composting, there's a good chance I can't answer them, but I will try my best. The other thing is, I am a master composter, not a master gardener. A lot of people don't know that you can get certified in master composting. What this means is that you take classes through UW Extension, and then you do community service, and then you get certified. Very different than Master Gardener insofar as time commitment. Master Gardener takes quite a lot when it comes to going to the various classes over months, and with composting, you can go to a few different classes and get your certification pretty quick. Also, at the end of this presentation, I do have a slide in case any of you want to take these classes. I would absolutely encourage it. They're wonderful. Even if you don't go out and do presentations, it's just wonderful knowledge for you to have for home composting. And that is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about composting in general, and then some ways that you can compost at home, very simple ways that anybody can compost and reduce their carbon footprint, like Ross was saying. Okay, so what is composting? Technically speaking, composting is controlling the natural process of decay to transform organic waste into a valuable soil amendment called compost. So it is controlling the natural processes of decay. Oh, by the way, I know this is very small. I'm going to try to zoom in on certain parts. Also, I believe at the end of this, Penny or Jenna will send you a copy of this via PDF, so you'll have all this information that you can come back to and look at. Also, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to give out some brochures that have some information as well. So why is composting important? Let's see if I can zoom in. So you see this right. This is 322 million pounds of yard waste end up in Wisconsin landfills every year. I believe in 2010, there was legislation banning yard waste entering landfills. It's not legal to dump your yard waste into a garbage can and then put it out on the curb, yet this still happens over and over again. And you can see 322 million pounds of yard waste end up in landfills. By composting alone, if Wisconsinites composted, they could reduce landfill waste, total landfill waste, by 25%. So this is quite an important number. Obviously, not everybody's going to compost, but even if one family composts, in 1 year, you can divert up to 625 pounds of yard waste and food scraps from landfills into compost. And it's not just, again, diverting this from landfills, it's creating something useful out of it, which we'll talk about in a second here. So not only are you taking the yard waste, food scraps out of the landfills, you are making something useful that you can use in your garden to help with creating healthy produce, with soil amendments, all kinds of things. So 3 things that compost does. 1, it improves your soil structure. It really doesn't matter what kind of soil you have. Compost is going to be useful for it. So let's say you have heavy soil, clay-ridden soil. You add compost to it, it lightens it up. It creates spaces for, as I say here in a little bit, it creates spaces for root structures to grow in for your plants. You have heavy soil, compost lightens it up. If you have sandy soil, you create better soil retention from compost. I'm going to pass some compost around in a minute, and you'll see all of the nooks and crannies that moisture can fit into. These are the same places that your plant roots get into. So it creates a symbiotic relationship there between the compost and the plants. And then better nutrient retention overall. Compost is often a space that's rich in nutrients from microbes, which we'll talk about in a second. It's a wonderful habitat for microbes that help your plants grow. They're living in that compost. No matter what kind of soil you enter or you introduce that compost to, you will aid in nutrient retention. It improves your soil quality. So soil pH is important for depending on what kind of plants that you are raising. Some plants have a little bit more acidic needs, some have more basic needs. Compost will help you balance your soil out. I'm going to talk about some things that you can put in your compost to either increase or decrease the soil pH. But in general, compost will just balance out that soil pH to a place where you can either get it neutral or you can get it to the point you can add things that you need for whatever plants that you have. Also, as I mentioned, it introduces beneficial microorganisms, which I'm going to talk about in detail in a second. These microorganisms are actually the workhorses behind creating compost. And then it improves plant access to nutrients. Compost is wonderful for encouraging root growth. Again, as I hand this compost around, just dig your fingers in it and look at all the tiny little nooks and crannies that plants can get their tiny roots in there. And then it allows plants better access to nutrients. We'll talk about this again later on in the slide presentation, but it creates places for plants to get, to pick up water, to pick up, oxygen for the microbes. It is essentially a superfood for your plants. Actually not a food, but a way for the plants to get food. So how is compost made? Oh, by the way, if you have any questions, please raise your hand at any time. I usually will pause before I go to another slide. So if you have questions, that's a great time to ask. But anytime you can interrupt me. So how is compost made? Compost is a naturally occurring process, really. It's all about the decay of organic matter. This happens all the time. If you go out into the forest and you look, especially a forest with deciduous trees, they drop their leaves. You look on the ground, and essentially compost is happening all the time. If you pick up the leaf bed on a forest floor, you can see there's leaves on top, and then there's some broken down material, and you get below that, and you have sand and soil and all these much tinier pieces. So essentially composting is happening naturally all the time. What we do is we help that process along. So there's two real superstars of composting. And maybe I can get in on this a little bit here. Okay. So macroorganisms are essentially creatures, animals, that help to break up organic material. They chew it up, they eat it, they digest it. Worms are amazing for this. We're going to talk about vermicomposting in a minute. You can see that black container right there. It's full of worms that are creating compost as we speak. Worms will eat organic material, and when they defecate, they create this wonderful material called castings, which then can be used as a soil amendment in itself. But in addition, I'm going to talk about worms for a second here. I might as well just take a pause. One of the great things about worms is as they are eating their way through the compost, as they're eating their way through organic material in your garden, they're creating all these holes that are aerating your garden. So a lot of these macroorganisms, sometimes they seem like pests. I'm going to show you a kind of a graphic here with some of these macroorganisms. Some of them are pests. You definitely don't want some of them in your homes. But in your compost pile, they're all very useful at breaking this material down so that the real rock stars of composting can do their thing. And those are bacteria. Bacteria are the things that are chemically changing organic material. And specifically, we're talking about aerobic bacteria. Aerobic, what does aerobic mean? Everybody's heard of aerobics, you know.
It's
oxygen. So these are oxygen-using bacteria. We're going to talk about how important it is to oxygenate, to turn your compost, to get these bacteria oxygen. They need oxygen to survive. And they are the ones who really take that organic material and turn it into the compost you're going to be using in your garden. There are other things that I'm not going to be talking about today. Enzymes that are active. Again, this gets in the science stuff that I'm not an expert in. Also, fungi are active in compost. There are all kinds of fungal networks existing right under us as we speak, and they are connecting plants, connecting their roots, connecting the water passages for plants. They're some people have called them like the internet of plants. They're connecting all kinds of things, and they are, again, vast networks of fungi right beneath us right now and in your compost. As I say here, 1 spoonful of compost, this is mind-blowing, contains 100 million bacteria and 800 feet of fungal threads in 1 spoonful. So fungal threads are very tiny here. And then it's a naturally occurring process, but as I say at the bottom, humans can accelerate this natural process of decay by helping these bacteria reproduce and flourish. I'm going to talk about that on the next slide, but maybe I can zoom in here to some of these organisms. Okay, so these macroorganisms, some of them you can see very well: worms, centipedes, beetles. Maybe when we get over to that compost heap at the end of this presentation, when Ross is turning it, you might see some of these creatures in there doing their thing. These are the biggest. Also, you'll dig in there, you'll see some pill bugs, sow bugs, roly-polies, whatever you want to call them. They're absolutely wonderful creatures. They eat dead leaves and decaying material. Those, along with worms, are some of the most beneficial composting creatures you can have. Let's see if I can get in on some of these smaller ones. As I say here, ants are not something you want in your house, but it's wonderful to have them actually in your compost, aerating it, digging in there, getting those bacteria the air that they need. This is why with ants specifically, you kind of want to have your compost heap not right next to the house. You want to have it a little bit of a distance away from the house. And then the ones you can't see are the tiny fungal spores, the bacteria, these actinomycetes. This is where I'm like losing it, but these are a very specific kind of organism that is neither bacteria nor plant, I believe. It's some sort of strange in-between creature. Again, this is where somebody on public access is going to be like, I know exactly what that is. And I'm like, you're better than me then. They're not, we don't have to concern ourselves with them today. What we're really going to talk about is the bacteria and how we can help them in order to create compost. And what we do for them is what you do for almost every living creature. They need 3 things. They need food, water, oxygen. We're going to talk about those 3 things in order. So food is one of the most intensive things that we can give to bacteria. I'm going to talk about a list of acceptable foods for not only the bacteria, but also when it says decomposers here, these are also some of those macroorganisms. They will feed on this stuff as well. Some of them you might assume from things you've heard about compost, or just, like I said, seeing the forest floor, leaves, grass clippings, yard debris, anything, basically any of this stuff you can just pick up right off here, these dead leaves. There's little pieces of bark, things like that. Of course, that is very good food for bacteria. But then there are some other things you might not think of. Any sort of kitchen scraps, vegetables, fruit peels, coffee grounds are great. If you use coffee grounds, do not pour coffee itself into compost, just the grounds, please. You can also put coffee filters in there. They will decompose as well. Eggshells are something a lot of people like to put in. I think Penny and Ross have some chickens over here. You can easily compost the eggshells. A lot of people say you should wash them out first. The reason for that, we'll get to some of the problems with composting meat and other like similar animal products, is that they can attract pests. This is the same thing with eggshells. If you don't wash them out, sometimes you can get some pests in there. But if you want to just throw your eggshells in, they will break down eventually. Used potting soil, a lot of times, me and Ross were talking about this earlier, sometimes you just want to dump the old potting soil from an old plant in there. That's totally fine, as long as it doesn't have any, it's good not to have pesticides on there or any sort of artificial fertilizers. It's great to just put it right naturally into your compost. Paper or cardboard, manure from herbivores. I'll talk about this in a second. You have to watch what kind of manure you put in there. Most weeds and garden debris. There is a There's a couple caveats if you're going to use weeds. I will talk about that in a minute because, of course, weeds make seeds that create more weeds that you don't want in your garden. So I'll talk about what to do about that. Sawdust, hay and straw. Human hair can be composted. Fur can be composted. Any sort of natural fibers. Cotton can be composted. Obviously, you don't want to just dump your shirt in there for reasons that we'll talk about in a second. Compost is always best when it's chopped up and made into fine pieces that those decomposers, the animals and bacteria that they can eat. Smaller pieces are always better.
Dryer lint.
Dryer lint, actually, absolutely, a great comment. Dryer lint can be put just right in there, turned into your compost, churned in there, and it creates food for your decomposers. Also, this has nothing to do with this. Dryer lint is one of the best tinders you can use if you're trying to start a fire, if you go camping. It's very dry, you just get one spark on it, lights right up. Okay, so here's some things to avoid when it comes to feeding those decomposers. Persistent weeds, crabgrass, quackgrass, any sort of invasive species, weeds that have gone to seed, you don't want to put that in your compost. I'll talk about some ways that if you do end up putting those things in your compost, it is possible to kill those seeds if the temperatures in that compost get high enough. Again, I'll hold off on that for a second, but best to avoid putting those weeds in there. If you want to put weeds in your compost, you can put them in a black plastic trash bag, leave it out in the sun, hot sun, for about a week, and that should kill those seeds. And then it is possible to put even persistent weed species, you can put them in your compost, but you have to kill those seeds. That's a big deal. Meat, dairy, oils. So meat actually will compost. Bones will compost. Any animal product will compost. When you go to a lot of these composting workshops, they'll be like, no, don't put any of that stuff in there. I'm here to tell you it will compost. It will decay. The bacteria will eat it. Here's the issue. If you put meat in compost, you're going to have pests. You're going to have things that are going to get into your compost and eat it. And so really, that is why a lot of times if you come to a presentation like this, they will tell you not to put animal products. They're very attractive to pest species. Cat or dog waste, the reason you don't want to do this is that there are certain parasites, ringworm, things like that can transfer from your pets to you if you eat things that have their waste in it. I just read a really interesting study of a medieval privy system. They went in there and dug around and found that all these monks had ringworm because they were composting human waste. This is back in the Middle Ages. But it ended up, they didn't realize that they were basically infecting themselves with ringworm through these compost heaps. Diseased plants, for obvious reasons, you don't want to transfer disease to your compost and then transfer it to your garden. Lime and ashes, this gets back to that conversation about pH balance. Ash will change your pH balance. It will create more basic pH. Lime, anything acidic, that will raise the pH. And then treated lumber or sawdust. Treated lumber, it says sawdust here. Sawdust can be composted, I'll tell you that in a second, but treated lumber has chemicals on it. That's the issue. You really want to keep chemicals out of the compost bin. Sawdust, I think the reason why it's here is because sawdust is, it can be very flat. It can be very moisture rich. It's very difficult to get. You've got to turn that sawdust so that the bacteria can get air. Again, we're going to have a slide about getting air to your compost. But sawdust, if you ever look at sawdust, you flip it over, it's always got a lot of moisture in it. It holds moisture, and sometimes it'll hold mold and things like that. It's a difficult material to compost. Also, wood itself is very, it takes a long time to decay. If you look at a tree that's fallen, it takes years and years for that tree to break down into smaller material. And it's the same thing with sawdust. I mean, you're just taking basically pieces of that tree. Okay, so another slide on pesticide. I should say this, part of this presentation, you can see, I mean, it's like ham-handedly kind of stuck together. The parts that don't seem to match, those are my personal slides. The rest of this is through The wonderful folks at UW Extension, anytime you go out as a composter and you give a presentation, they give you all kinds of materials. That's where these wonderful materials came from that I'll be referring to in a minute. And so some of these slides come from them. So this is one of those slides. It's just another reminder not to put pesticides in. That's because they can be persistent. A lot of times they'll wear off in a year, but sometimes you're going to want to use that compost before a year. And so just try not to add.
What if it's an organic sort of thing, like BT or something?
Organic pesticides are different insofar as I'm talking about like Roundup, things that you would spray on
That's an herbicide, but
yeah, or exactly, right on, exactly. Herbicides, obviously, you don't want to put in there as well. Some survive the composting process. They can damage plants, of course. Materials with special needs, pine needles. I actually, personally, I avoid pine needles altogether. I don't like them because they can change the pH balance of your compost. It takes forever for pine needles to break down. If you put too many in, pretty soon you're finding that your compost is like primarily pine needles. Walnut leaves, for obvious reasons. Walnuts have a chemical in them that's toxic to plants. What is the chemical? It starts with a J. Again, historian here. But trust me, walnut trees are toxic to some plants. Walnut leaves are toxic to plants. Walnut pieces, sticks, anything like that, you want to keep it out of your compost. And then sod, because sod is very dense. It's very difficult to aerate sod. Okay, so this is possibly, the next section is possibly the most important for you folks when you're at home trying to feed these bacteria. Because the big question is, what do you feed your bacteria to get the compost? They need two things. They need carbon and nitrogen. So the bacteria need carbon and nitrogen because it's essentially their building blocks. They eat the carbon, they use nitrogen for cell production. And also what's interesting is plants need nitrogen as well. So your compost, by having nitrogen with these microbes, you're actually going to help your plants as well because they need the same building blocks. So you need carbon and nitrogen. And what we talk about in the world of composting is browns and greens. Browns are carbon, greens are nitrogen. When you think about browns, you think of dry material. When you think of greens, you think of wet, moist material. Carbon-rich material, browns, nitrogen-rich material, greens. The proper ratio when you mix these things together in your compost bin is try to get 2 to 3 parts brown, carbon, to 1 part nitrogen. When I say 2 parts to 1, we're talking about volume and not necessarily weight. Because you'll find kitchen scraps are going to weigh a lot more because they've got a lot of water in them. They've got a lot of water content, and that weighs. If you dry out, I mean, anybody who's put any sort of fruit in a dehydrator, you'll notice it's very light at the end of it because all that water weight's gone. So when you're putting it in, though, the water weight's probably still going to be there. So we're talking about volume. Let's say just 1 handful of kitchen scraps to 2 to 3 handfuls of leaves. Then you mix that around. Okay, so more about this mixture of carbon to nitrogen. If there are high amounts of carbon, too much dry, too much browns, your decomposition process will be slower. If you look at sticks, right, things that are high carbon value. I'm going to get into this on the next slide with a couple of really wonderful charts that show you the carbon content of various items. But something like, think of something very dry and thick, like a corn stalk, right? If you ever try to compost corn stalks, you will realize how difficult it is. It takes forever for them to break down. You've got to really chop them up and get them in there because they have a very high carbon content. So anything higher, these numbers will make sense on the next slide for sure. And I did a little fiddling with this because I feel like they had the number a little bit off. In my experience, about 35 to 1. You get higher than that, and it starts to slow down that decomposition process. You get a lot of dry compost. But if you have too much nitrogen, if you have too many table scraps, you are also going to slow down that composting process. You are going to create anaerobic, so oxygen deprived conditions. If you think about a big old heap of just wet garbage, what happens to it after a while? What grows on it? Mold. It gets mold on it because it's got too much moisture. There needs to be that mixture of the greens to browns in about a 30-to-1 ratio. You want that 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen mixture in your compost.
What do you do in the summer when you've got all this green stuff, but nobody's really hard in the sun?
That is a great question. That is it.
I want a great answer.
Yes. The answer is, and I'll cover this on another slide, but I'll tell you right now. I will repeat the question. The question is, what do you do with all the greens in the summer? Because the summer you accumulate greens. The fall you accumulate browns. This is why it's great that we're doing this right now, because folks, you got to get your browns together. You have to have a bunch of leaves that you keep throughout the year. And those are going to be your browns in the summer. That is my best answer to how to keep those greens at bay, is you've got to prep. Composting actually takes some preparation work, some forethought, and it starts in the fall. Composting always starts in the fall. That's what I tell people all the time, is hoard those browns in the fall because you are going to use them as your browns in the summer. So that's my quick answer. I'll get to that again in a second here. Okay, so and in fact, it's on this slide. I'm going to try to maybe zoom in on these so that people can see them a little bit better. So some examples of browns. Leaves are the best brown that you can get. Absolute best. And I'm actually going to back out of this for a second and show you why. Forget it. I'm going to go back, then I'll back out because I'll talk about a couple of these. So leaves, straw, paper. Now watch what kind of paper we're talking about, because just printer paper, that's different than newspaper. Newspaper actually has a higher carbon content than loose leaf paper, or what I don't know what you call printer paper. Newspaper actually is wonderful compost, but you have to treat it right. You have to break it down into small pieces before you get in there. It can take quite a while for newspaper to break down. But if you don't have any browns, I do tell people newspaper can be a good substitute. You have to treat it right first. You have to break it up into very small pieces. You can tear it into strips, but that will, unless your compost is really going and you got some heat in there, it will take a while. Yes, question?
Could you just use a newspaper shredder?
Absolutely. Paper shredders are wonderful for compost. But with that, you want to make sure that it doesn't compact too much, because paper that compacts too much will create that anaerobic conditions again. You just throw a newspaper in there, like just a flat newspaper. There's nothing getting in between those pages. It's just going to mold. It's going to sit there. It's going to take a long time. So this is wonderful. You can actually, they're non-toxic. You can eat newspaper. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's non-toxic to humans. It's non-toxic to plants. So even the glossy pages, the ink is non-toxic.
What about junk mail?
Ooh, I don't know about junk mail. I know newspapers though. I know newspapers, the ink that they use in newspapers is safe. So that's a really great question. If you just have junk mail, what can you do? I think it's probably okay, but it's a question I need to look into for sure. I've never had that question before about junk mail. Great question though, because what do you do with junk mail? Absolutely compost it. And also I would say this, you can create compost that is not necessarily going directly on your vegetable garden. You can make soil amendments for all kinds of things. You can put it all around your yard to help with, for instance, let's say you have clay soil, the water's not going into your soil like you'd like. Mix that up with compost and all of a sudden you've got soil that's retaining moisture. Okay, great. So I want to zoom out for a second and just zoom in on this chart here. Remember I said the proper ratio that you want in your compost bin for those bacteria, those decomposers to grow, is about a 30-to-1 ratio. Check out that first one. Autumn leaves, if you get maple leaves are the absolute perfect compost, period. Period. They're about a 30-to-1 ratio right in the leaf itself. You get maple leaves, find them from somebody, I mean, good Lord, they're everywhere on the curb. Just find maple leaves from someone else, bag them up and take them home. Oak leaves, I don't know if we have, I think they have an oak tree here. If you, after this presentation, if you go around and you take an oak leaf, you'll notice it's a little bit drier, a little bit thicker. It's a little bit more difficult to tear than a maple leaf. And that means it's gonna be more difficult to break down. Oak leaves are still fine. Most leaves from deciduous trees are gonna be fine. But maple leaves are the absolute best. And then you look at straw, between 40 and 100-to-1. Wood chips or sawdust, as you get more into wood, it gets higher. 500-to-1, you are getting way far away from that 35-to-1. It is good to have, I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but it's good to have some sticks or some bigger debris in your compost because it aids in aeration. It will create spaces for air to get in. You don't want just sticks in your compost though. It makes it difficult to turn. Little sticks I'm talking about. As I hand this compost around in a second here, you'll see there's tiny little sticks. They take a long time to break down, but they're very good, again, for aeration. Mixed paper, as you see here, like I said, that's newspaper, 150 to 200. Newspaper, corrugated cardboard. Cardboard takes a while to break down as well. You see 560-to-1, okay? So really, leaves are your best brown, period. Which is why, which is why you want to keep those leaves in the fall. Like I say here, browns decay slowly. Coarse browns keep the pile aerated. That's what I'm talking about with those sticks. They tend to accumulate in the fall, so you want to hoard them. You may need to stockpile them until they can be mixed with greens. I'm going to tell you how to stockpile them. Actually, I might just do that. No, I'll refer to it right now, but I'll come back to it. You see that round? It's like a miniature. Thank you, Ross. You can make it out of chicken wire. You can create it out of any sort of wire. That is a great place to hold your leaves. You make a big old bin of that, and then you can just reach in there and put it right into your compost bin throughout the year. All right, so with regard to greens, grass clippings, vegetable scraps, like I said, coffee grounds, manure from cows, horses, poultry, rabbits. If you have poultry, some backyard chickens, their eggs, their manure, they're great composting materials. It's a symbiotic relationship. Greens decay more rapidly, but they do aerate poorly. If you have greens just sitting on top of one of them, you just dump your kitchen scraps and you don't aerate properly. I'm going to talk about aeration in a minute. If you don't turn that with those browns, they're just going to sit there and they're going to rot. And when they rot, they create smells. They tend to accumulate in the spring and summer, as we've talked about again and again. So you've got to have those browns on hand to mix with the greens. All right, now I want to show you a little bit here about, okay, so if you look down here at these carbon to nitrogen ratios, you'll see there is no green that meets that 30-to-1 ratio. It just doesn't happen. You can compost maple leaves and they will almost create compost on their own. But with any sort of green, you've got to add browns to it. You absolutely have to get it to that ratio. If not, it's just going to sit there and mold. Vegetable scraps, it all depends on the kind of vegetable that you have. Something like you throw a overripe tomato on there, that's something that's going to be very high in nitrogen and water content. If you throw a banana peel, that's going to be a little bit less. It's more spread out. It's going to have aeration. Grass clippings are a tough one because a lot of times people will mow their grass. People always ask me, what should I do with my grass? And my recommendation is buy a mulching lawnmower. Best thing you can do. A mulching lawnmower is the one that doesn't have the, I don't know what you call it, exhaust pipe, whatever you want to say. The thing that doesn't shoot the grass out into rows into your, a side discharge, exactly. You want something without that. So it's just, there's usually a flap that you can put the side discharge thing on there. You can take that off, and it clips it right back into tiny little parts that go right into your lawn. And that's the best thing to do with grass clippings, because a lot of times, let's say you have a bag on the back of your lawnmower, and you take those grass clippings, you put them in the compost, it will create an anaerobic situation because they're just so dense and full of water. It's really hard to get those, if you have a big ton of grass clippings, to get them mixed in. You gotta have a lot of browns in there. And then manure, you can see about 5 to 1. Manure obviously can be very moisture rich, very nitrogen rich. All right, so we've talked about food. These decomposers also need water. If you find that your compost heap is getting too dry, you need to take a hose to it and spray it down with the mister function. Don't blast it with the stream. It's usually best to get a mist on it as if it was raining. If you have an open compost bin, you probably won't, or compost heap, you probably won't have to water it as much as if you have a closed bin like the one at the very end there. I'll talk about the different bins in a second. How much is too much? It really is, there's a lot of intuition that goes into compost. There's a lot of science, but for someone like me who's not a scientist, there is a lot of intuition. One of the rules of thumb is about as damp as a wrung out sponge. So you wring out a sponge, you feel it, it's got a little dampness to it. It's not gonna be wet, you're not gonna touch that compost and bring your hand back and have actual dampness, moisture that would maybe reflect the sunlight. You don't really want that. You just want it to feel a little bit damp. And again, when we get into that compost over there in a minute, we are going to get your hands in it and you can feel the kind of dampness that we're talking about. It says about 40 to 60% moisture. I don't know what those numbers mean really, because that seems like a lot to me. I would go with as damp as a wrung out sponge. You should get in there and feel a little bit of dampness. We've talked about food, we've talked about water. Now we need to talk about oxygen, and this is actually one of the more difficult steps. In some ways, it's very easy because it's just the air that's all around us. But if there is not appropriate oxygen in your compost pile, composting, the decaying process will not happen. Those bacteria, those aerobic bacteria, will turn into anaerobic. They will die. They won't have the kind of air they need to live and eat and thrive. The lack of oxygen will be immediately apparent in the smell that is coming from your compost bin. If you smell compost, I'm gonna hand this around right now, I want you all to sniff it. Whenever I give people compost to sniff, they're like, nah, because they think it's gonna stink. It smells wonderful. It smells like earth. There should be no smell whatsoever. And also, as you look in there, look at all the little bits that are in there. It shouldn't just be like Ross was saying, dirt is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about soil and soil amendment. There's all kinds of organic material in there. You might see little bits of seeds in there, things that are little bits of stick or twig, or I think I might even seen a couple pine needles in there. But give it a good sniff and you'll see it smells wonderful. Just smells like earth. If your compost is starting to stink, it means that you need to mix browns in there. You've got to mix the browns because the browns, by the process of mixing, I'm going to talk about this on the next slide, but by the process of mixing, you will create the air needed for those bacteria to live. Okay, so this is kind of a cut-off picture, but there are different ways to aerate and vent your compost heap. The best way is on the next slide called turning. You can put various kinds of pipes in there. See, these are the sticks I'm talking about. I personally don't want big sticks like that because it makes it very difficult to turn, but some people like to have sticks in their compost. You can take the sticks and kind of situate them around in that. By your movement, it creates a kind of turning process that aerates. I would prefer to just go ahead and use a tool. Yes, go ahead.
So you're saying that just turning the compost gets the air in there?
Yes.
Because I have a composter that tumbles.
Yes.
But it doesn't get there's not a lot of air going in there.
Yes.
So I need to be turning it
No. That is the absolute perfect, I mean, I'm gonna do a big reveal here, mystery's over. I prefer the tumbler. That is, in my opinion, the absolute best composter. Oh, I should repeat the question. The question was, if you have a tumbler, is your compost getting oxygen? The short answer is yes. It's a wonderful aerator, an amazing aerator.
Without me
Yep.
doing it with,
You have to tumble it, and that aerates it.
okay.
That's it. It's wonderful. It does it for you. In fact, I'm going to go to the next slide because this is the most forgotten element of composting is turning. You have got to turn your compost. I run into this problem all the time with folks, and this is why I have to say it's better than nothing, but this one on the end here, sorry if I'm not in frame anymore, this guy, absolute worst composter on the planet. And this is one you find everywhere, okay? And the reason why it's the worst is it's hard to get in there and aerate it. It's really hard. And we're gonna see over there, Ross is gonna demonstrate how it is possible. He's a great composter. That compost over there is top notch, but he gets in there and he aerates it. This is where you access the compost when it's done, and sometimes it's black gold under there, but sometimes you look in there and you're just like, okay, nothing's happened. It's just eggshells and a bunch of junk that I put in there 3 years ago. This happens to me all the time. People say, why is it the case? I'm putting all this stuff in there. And I say, how often do you turn it? And they say, turn it? Yeah, you've got to turn it. Because if you don't turn the compost, I mean, it is a living thing here. There are creatures in there that need to breathe, and you've got to get them that air. So there's a picture here of a little guy in kind of one of these crate-style composters, and he's in there with a pitchfork. I created a compost bin for my mom. I do it all the time with pallets. They're great if you want to recycle stuff. Go to the back of any supermarket and they're going to have free pallets. You can create a compost bin real easy out of pallets. Just 4 of them, open one side, get in there with your pitchfork, and you can compost, turn your compost real easy. This kind of tool is, Ross and I were talking about this the other day. Semi-effective, it goes, you stab it in, and these 2 little flaps close, and then you pull out, and as you pull, it opens, and that's how it aerates. But I think it's pretty labor intensive. I don't know if it often works. Do you have a question?
I was gonna say, I have one of those. It was impossible to, I mean, that's kind of short and small, but there was no way they could do that.
Agreed. I mean, I'm going to give you hot takes here, and my hot take is those things are terrible. And again, that is not my preferred compost method. If you want to turn it, if you turn it, it's going to be great. But most people just want to throw stuff in and not, not dedicate, time to turning. And turning also is something you have to, there has to be a bit of intuition about it too, because I don't know that, I think it's possible to disrupt the composting process if you turn too much, because as we're going to look at another slide, these bacteria, as they start to eat, they start to produce heat. And that heat enables the composting process to basically, it's like supercharges it. And if you're turning your compost a lot, you're going to turn that heat from the inside, you're going to put it to the outside, and it's going to lose the heat. Now, it's not going to kill the bacteria, it's just going to make it so it's not maybe the composting process isn't as fast if you're turning too often. But I would say it's better to turn too often than not enough. The amount of turning is going to depend on what kind of composting you do. That tumbler is by far, in my opinion and my own personal experience, the best composting method, because you turn it every single time you enter something, or you put something in there. You put your scraps in the top. I'll demonstrate in a minute. You put the scraps in the top, you turn it 3 times, you leave it. Every single time you go out there. I used to turn mine every day. I would go out, put stuff in, turn it. And the food, the newspaper, my gosh, newspaper disappears. It's just like the absolute fastest way, in my opinion, to get compost. Okay, so pile turning tips, mix from the outside to the middle. So what you want to do is you want to take the pieces on the outside, you want to get that food into that bacteria that's eating on the inside and making all this heat. You want to basically You can't just, also, one of the reasons you want to go to the middle as well is because if there's a place that's going to go anaerobic, if there's a place that's going to lose oxygen, it's going to be in the dead center. So you want, or at the very bottom. So you want to get that stuff out and get it aerated. Use a garden fork or shovel. I think a pitchfork is wonderful for this. Commercial turning tools are available, but Ross has a really great one over there. As we've talked about, these ones I do not prefer. In fact, I should have put a little X on them. But I know some people do like them. Okay, so just a real quick thing. This is something that the folks from the extension put in here, this slide. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but breaking things down is always a little bit better. If you've got a big old newspaper, again, you got to get into smaller pieces so that those decomposers can start to eat it and there's aeration involved. If you have leaves, you can put those through a shredder. You can put that, actually, one of the things you can do is, if you want to, for folks who don't have a compost bin but want to get rid of their leaves, the worst thing you can do is rake your leaves and put them on the curb. Absolute worst. Best thing you can do if you don't have a compost bin or don't want to have one, mow your leaves. Mow them 2 or 3 times. Just cut them up into tiny little bits. If you have that mulching mower, it'll do it for you. Just mow over your leaves 2 or 3 times, and by the spring, they will be absorbed down into the grass. Okay, so you will find as your little bacteria are doing their thing, you'll find that your compost bin is hot. You get your hand down in there and it's kicking off heat. You look in, when you open up that, the tumbler, it honestly is just kicking out heat. You put your hand in and it's warm heat, warm air coming out, very moist air. This is because if you think about just like when you're working out, you're creating heat. These little bacteria are basically working out. They're eating, reproducing, and they're creating heat. And as the heat rises, different bacteria take over. There's 3 different types of bacteria. Again, not a scientist, forgot their names, but at various stages, they take over. At the lower stages, about to, I think it's 120 degrees, don't quote me. I'm on TV, don't quote me. But around 100 plus degrees, new bacteria kick in. And then around 100 and I think 130, the highest heat bacteria kick in. And if they start getting too hot, they will naturally start to die off. You don't want your compost bin to be above, I believe, 160 degrees. It will start to kill off the bacteria. It's okay. Like, they will come back once the heat dissipates. But for instance, if you have a tumbler, I would recommend keeping that tumbler maybe in a shady location because it's going to create heat on its own. And a lot of them are black because for folks who are not creating effective compost, sometimes the sun's heat will aid that process. But if you're already turning, you don't need to have it out in the direct sunlight. Oh, also, heat greater than 160 degrees is oftentimes going to kill those little animals that are living in there too. They don't want heat that high. Does my compost have to get hot? No, it doesn't. A lot of times, those bins at the far corner, the commercial bins that are available everywhere, most times, in fact, I think in Ross's, if you reach in there, I reached in there a little bit, and it's not kicking off heat because it's a more slow composting process. I'm almost done, folks. I'm realizing this is taking a lot of time. But basically, you don't have to have heat, but the heat does help those bacteria to thrive. And so if your compost is a little bit cooler, it's just going to take longer. Sometimes it's going to take 2 or 3 years in that, the one on the end there.
What about winter when it's 5 degrees up?
They will go dormant. The bacteria go dormant. They don't die, or maybe they do die, but I know that they come back. I'm pretty positive they go dormant though, because they'll come back the next year. As it's starting to heat up, as it starts to get spring, tumble that thing a few times before putting anything in it. If you put stuff in it and you realize it's not going anywhere, if you put stuff in the winter, it's not going anywhere, that means that they're dormant. They'll come back though. I would say this too, If you're really committed to composting, get some 5-gallon buckets out in your garage, dump your green kitchen scraps in there all winter. They'll just freeze. And then you can put them in your compost when they thaw. Okay, so I'm gonna try to get right through this. There are a couple different ways of composting. There's something called hot composting. It is in this brochure. It is intensive in the beginning, but it produces compost the fastest means possible. It is kind of a lasagna method. You put browns, you put greens, browns, greens, browns, and you stack it up about 3 feet tall, and you turn that thing every week, and you start turning it. Well, you have to turn a little bit less. There's instructions in there. Again, I'm gonna go a little bit faster now so that we can get through here. But hot composting is essentially a recipe for the fastest composting, but it is the most labor intensive because you got to be out there turning it a bunch. And you have to have all the materials ready to go to make that hot composting pile from the beginning. Again, it's layered and then you turn. And in 12 weeks, you have the compost ready. So this is something you could do early in the year and maybe have it ready by the end of your growing season. Okay, so again, I'm gonna just go right through hot composting. We actually have these recipe cards that I can hand out to anybody who's interested in hot composting. The UW Extension prints them out. They're really wonderful. They tell you the recipe for both hot and cold composting. I'd be willing to give those out to anybody who wants those at the end. They're wonderful. Cold composting, a lot easier. That's just what we're talking about here. Any of these composting methods that are on that table, they're all gonna be cold composting. Even though they're kicking out heat, hot composting only means that lasagna method of composting. Any other style of composting is cold composting. And the way to do it, it's so easy. You take your kitchen scraps, you take your yard waste, your greens, you put them in, you have your reservoir of browns, you take 1 handful or however much, just by volume, you take a bucket full of greens, 3 bucketfuls of browns, mix it in. That's it. And then you got to aerate it. You got to interact with your compost heap. If it starts to smell, you know you have to add browns and aerate. That's it. If it's kicking off heat, it doesn't smell, it smells like that compost that we handed off, then it's good, it's doing great. Just keep doing your thing. This takes a little bit longer though, 6 months to 2 years. If you have one of those ones at the end, I guarantee it's not gonna happen fast. I don't know, they're the absolute worst if you want to get fast compost. Okay, to bin or not to bin, there's a bunch of different ways you can, a bunch of different methods for composting. Just to talk about some of these, we've already talked about this one. This one is, again, my personal favorite. You put stuff in the top, you put it in this side, you spin it. I mean, actually, when I do it, I put it in both sides. I don't even care. Really, it's like I look in this side, is there still some newspaper clippings? There's still some browns I can see? Okay, I'm gonna put them in this side then. Anything that's not decomposed in the one side, you put it in the other. Just, you gotta look and have some intuition with it. You put it in, you give it 2 or 3 spins, and it's done. And I would say, I mean, it is so fast once you get the compost started. Oh, actually, we haven't talked about this. Do you need a compost additive? That's a question I get sometimes. No, you don't. You can buy them at the store. It's basically microbes, bacteria. You put it in your compost to start out with. It's gonna get it started. Yes, it might help it go a little faster, but they're existing all over the place right now. Whatever organic material you put in there is gonna attract the bacteria necessary for composting. This is another tough, it's just circle made of chicken wire or whatever kind of wire. Wonderful for aeration, not easy to turn. Very difficult to turn because you get in there with your pitchfork, you catch it on stuff, you tip the thing over, it's absolute nightmare. This is wonderful for holding browns though. Get 2 or 3 of those lined up, fill them up with browns, and then just take that out and put that right in here. This is another one, it's a little bit, it's about an in-between. You can make them out of pallets. It's like basically a 4-sided compost bin. I would say, again, pallets are really easy. You put something like this to keep, I guess, pests out. Although it's very difficult to keep pests out of compost that isn't. This is a great one. Again, I'm sorry, man. I'm just keep on harping on it. This is a great one though, because pests can't get in here. In my old neighborhood, me and my ex-wife had rats that dug holes right into the compost. And I lifted up the thing, 2 little rats are staring at me. I'm not even kidding. It was like rat haven. And I'm talking not mice, rats, people. So, and they will dig right under there. And it's a super highway. You drop your stuff in, and even if you try to mix it around, I mean, they're great at finding food and digging in there. So keeping pests out can be a problematic situation with compost, but if you have a fully contained one, they can't get inside there. Also, I just want to quickly talk about this particular method here. There are other ways to compost besides a heap. One of the most ancient ways of composting, and again, I'm a historian, I love this kind of stuff, is to just put nitrogen-rich material into a ditch next to your plants. Okay, so here's a great method for doing it. Let's say you are, and again, composting takes some measure of forethought. You have to do some preparation. So if you want to create the trench method, basically you dig a long trench in your garden, you fill that thing with greens, scraps, whatever kind of nitrogen-rich scraps, you cover that up, but you can't just put plants in it right away. You've got to leave it for about a year, and the next year you can plant right on top of that row. I know people who don't plant on the rows that they put the greens in. They just put them on the sides and let it seep in that way. Both methods are, again, very ancient methods. They're very, talk about not labor intensive. It's a lot of labor up front to dig that trench. Afterward, you don't have to worry about it anymore. We'll also talk about vermicomposting in a minute. Some examples of homemade bins. This is a really popular style. I personally don't like the way it looks, but what you do is it's easy to store your browns and then mix them at various stages. You've got a lot of times, like this will be the side that is not. It's got browns that are basically not composting. You take them, you put them in there, you put them in there. As the compost gets going, as you transfer it, it gets closer to the finished product. Okay, we talked about some of these bins. Again, I prefer the tumbler. Bin or pile location, common sense. Put your bin near the place where you're going to use it. It makes it a lot easier. You probably don't want it right next to the house because of pests. It will attract animals. Like I said, if rats are an issue in your neighborhood, like they were in my East Side neighborhood, they will be attracted to that compost bin. They also love chickens, by the way. So if you got chickens and compost, welcome to a rat family. Be a good neighbor. Keep it away from your neighbor's spot if they're not interested in your compost, if they don't want to see it. Sometimes composting is not attractive to the eye. It's a big heap of stuff. It can be a little bit, unsightly. Okay, when is composting finished? It should look a lot like the stuff that you touched earlier. You shouldn't see any sort of wet table scraps left. Those should all be well and gone. It should smell of earth. It should not stink at all. It should smell beautiful of earth. And then it says organic materials are unrecognizable. You're gonna recognize some stuff in there. Like if you look at that wonderful compost, you've got seeds, pumpkin seed in there. You've got little bits of stick, this big, but they're good because they help aeration. And then ambient temperature, all that means is that heat that's been kicking off from the bacteria, that has gone down now because they've done their work. Using compost, we already talked about in the beginning. This is kind of a redundant slide, but you can put compost on your gardens, flower beds, house plants. You can use it as a soil amendment for reasons that we talked about earlier, all those reasons.
Any time of the year that it's best to put compost on?
It all depends on what the use is. So for instance,
It doesn't lose its power if you put it on late summer and late spring.
No, I mean, the thing is that what's wonderful about it is compost contains those microbes. Sometimes they die, sometimes because we talked about when the temperature gets too high, things like that, sometimes they go dormant. But basically, wherever you use compost, it's going to that soil amendment is going to last. Okay, so if you have big pieces, sometimes you want to put them on a screen. This is one of the. So if you just want to put it on the top of your soil, you can do that. You can also mix it in with your soil. This is probably the best way to use compost if you want to use it in your garden. Mix it into about 6 inches of topsoil. So 2 inches of compost mixed with about 6 to 8 inches of topsoil. You spread it on, mix it around. One of the most interesting things that I've experimented with is compost tea. If you put compost in a little baggie, a satchel, and put it into water, it will transport a lot of those microbes into the water, and you can just use it as like a watering can. So it transports all those wonderful microbes down into your soil. Now, this is complicated because they're like, well, you want to get it aerated and blah, blah. You don't need to. It's probably better, but I've done it without, and it's wonderful. Okay, so here are the last points. In summation, what your compost needs is a balanced diet. It needs food, it needs water, and it needs air. So if you remember those 3-to-1 browns to greens, that is the perfect ratio of food for those little organisms. You get the browns to greens together, you water it, you turn it, and you will have wonderful, wonderful compost in 6 months to a year. Okay, thank you very much, and we will, I'm gonna hand out those little flyers. We will go over there quick before the sun goes down and look at some, we'll get hands-on and do some composting, and I also want folks to see that vermicomposting as well. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you.